Welcome to Hanya English Podcast. Today we're doing a deep dive into something called a brain switch.
Yeah, the brain switch. It's all about rewiring your brain.
Exactly. Rewiring it to think and speak in English fluently. I mean, we've all been there, right?
Oh, absolutely.
You know that feeling where you understand what someone is saying, but then you freeze up when you try to respond
Totally.
because you're stuck translating everything in your head.
It's so frustrating. Like you have all these thoughts and ideas,
Yeah.
but they get lost in translation.
And that's what we're calling the brain switch problem.
The brain switch problem.
It's the challenge of shifting away from thinking in your native language
Right.
and into thinking directly in English.
You got it.
So let's break this down a bit. What's really going on in our minds when we hit that pause button before speaking English?
Okay, so imagine this.
Okay.
You're trying to have a simple conversation with a native English speaker.
Sure, like about our hobbies or something.
Exactly, something casual. But then instead of just expressing your thoughts naturally,
You get stuck.
you get totally stuck in this loop of translating every single word in your head.
And that takes time.
Yes, so much time.
It makes the conversation feel so clunky and unnatural.
It's like you're driving with the parking brake on. You can move forward, but it's slow and jerky.
And exhausting.
Oh, absolutely. It's mentally exhausting.
We call that cognitive overload, right?
Yeah, cognitive overload. And it's a huge barrier to fluency. Think about it. Your brain is trying to juggle like a million things at once. It's trying to understand what the other person is saying. Then it has to translate your thoughts into English. Oh, and on top of that, it's also trying to remember all the grammar rules
Yeah.
and produce, coherent sentences.
Right. It's like trying to run a marathon while solving a Rubik's Cube at the same time.
Uh-huh. Exactly. And all of this can lead to some pretty negative consequences.
Right.
Like anxiety and self-doubt. Some people even start to avoid speaking English altogether because it's just so overwhelming.
It becomes a vicious cycle. You get anxious about making mistakes, and then you overthink everything, which, leads to more mistakes.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Traditional language learning methods.
You mean like classes and textbooks?
Yeah, those often make this mental translation habit even worse.
I'm surprised to hear that. I mean, don't we learn grammar and vocabulary in language classes?
Of course we do. But the way it's usually taught focuses way too much on rote memorization. Like just repeating things over and over without really understanding them.
Loud memorization. Got it.
And while grammar and vocabulary are super important,
Of course.
they don't magically give you the mental agility to switch between languages.
So you could ace a grammar test,
You could.
but still struggle in a real conversation,
Exactly. It's like learning all the parts of a bicycle.
but not knowing how to ride it.
Precisely.
So traditional methods often fall short because they don't address that core issue of training our brains to think directly in English.
You hit the nail on the head. And that's where the brain switch hack comes in. It's not just about adding more words to your vocabulary or mastering grammar rules.
It's about changing the way you think about English,
Yes.
rewiring those pathways in your brain.
Exactly. To create a direct link between thought and expression in English.
And the amazing thing is that our brains are actually incredibly adaptable
Oh, they are. Like amazingly adaptable.
with the right techniques.
Yeah, the right techniques.
We can actually train ourselves to think in English just as naturally as we think in our native language.
It's so encouraging, right? It means that fluency isn't some impossible dream reserved for a select few.
It's a skill that anyone can develop if they have the right approach.
Absolutely.
And in the next part of this deep dive, we're going to explore some practical strategies for flipping that brain switch.
Yes, we'll talk about how you can unlock a whole new level of fluency and confidence in English.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it.
Welcome back to the Honey English Podcast. We're continuing our deep dive into the brain switch hack.
Yeah, so in part one, we talked about how translating in your head can really hold you back from speaking English fluently.
Remember, like you're trying to have a conversation, but you're stuck with a dictionary in your brain.
Right. But the good news is
The good news is,
we can actually train our brains.
Train our brain
to think directly in English.
Exactly. Our brains are pretty amazing. They can adapt and change, It's not like they're set in stone.
So where do we start? How do we actually rewire our brains to think in English?
Okay, so one of the most important things is immersion.
Immersion.
Yeah, like you want to surround yourself with English as much as possible.
So it's not just about sitting down and studying grammar rules.
It's more about making English a part of your everyday life.
Got it.
You can change your phone settings to English, listen to English music and podcasts, and, even watch movies and TV shows in English.
Those are great ideas. I love watching movies.
And the more you do this, the more your brain will start picking up on the patterns and rhythms of the language,
It's like you're creating this mental world.
A mental world.
Where English feels natural and familiar.
Exactly. And another super helpful technique is something called internal narration.
Internal narration. What's that?
Basically, you just talk to yourself in English throughout the day.
Like narrate what I'm doing.
Yes. For example, if you're making breakfast,
okay,
you can say to yourself, I'm making breakfast. I'm pouring a cup of coffee and toasting some bread. Like that.
So it's like becoming your own English-speaking commentator.
Exactly. And you can do this anywhere, anytime.
I like that.
In the shower, waiting in line, even while you're falling asleep.
So it just becomes a habit to think in English.
Exactly. And speaking of habits, let's talk about flashcards.
Oh yeah, flashcards. I use those all the time for vocabulary.
They're great, but we're going to use them a little differently.
Okay.
Instead of having a word in your native language on one side.
Yeah, and the English word on the other.
Try using just pictures.
Pictures.
Yeah, so on one side you have a picture, of a cat.
Okay, a cat.
And on the other side you write the word cat in English. No translation.
So this forces you to think in English directly.
Exactly. You're connecting the image directly with the English word.
No more mental translation.
No more mental translation. And another powerful technique is shadowing.
Shadowing? What's that? Does it involve actual shadows?
No. It's basically when you listen to an audio recording of a native English speaker.
Okay.
And repeat what they're saying.
So I'm echoing them.
Yeah, you're trying to mimic their rhythm and pronunciation as closely as possible.
Okay, so where can I find good shadowing material?
Oh, there are tons of resources online. Podcasts, speeches, even movie clips.
Cool.
You can find transcripts too, so you can follow along.
So I'm actively practicing my pronunciation.
Yes. And it really helps to improve your fluency and make your English sound more natural. So are you ready to take your brain switch to the next level?
I think so. Where do we go from here?
Okay. How about a 7-day challenge?
A 7-day challenge. I like a challenge.
Okay, so for the next 7 days, I want you to try and incorporate these brain switch techniques into your daily routine.
Sounds good.
Even if it's just for 15 minutes each day.
15 minutes? I can do that.
Maybe 5 minutes of internal narration, 5 minutes of flashcards, and 5 minutes of shadowing.
Okay, small steps.
Small, consistent steps.
Yeah.
And at the end of each day, just take a moment to reflect.
Reflect.
Yeah, think about what felt easy, what felt challenging, and if you noticed any changes in the way you think in English.
So I'm kind of experimenting on myself.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm excited to get started with this challenge. I think it'll be a great way to kickstart this whole brain switch process.
It definitely will. And in part 3, we'll explore some even more advanced techniques and resources to really take your fluency to a whole new level.
Welcome back to Hania English Podcast. We're wrapping up our deep dive into the brain switch hack today.
Yeah, we've talked about how to shift away from translating in your head and move towards thinking directly in English.
Right. We've covered techniques like immersion and internal narration.
Flashcards and shadowing too.
So many great strategies.
Yeah.
But I heard you have some bonus tips.
I do. Some advanced brain switch moves. Are you ready?
I am. Hit me with them.
Okay, well, one technique I love is visualization.
Visualization.
Yeah. You're basically creating pictures in your mind.
Oh, so using my imagination to help me remember English phrases.
Exactly. So let's say you're learning the expression to take a break.
Okay, to take a break.
Don't just repeat the words. Picture yourself actually taking a break.
All right. I can imagine myself at a park, sitting on a bench, enjoying the sunshine.
Perfect. Make it vivid, you know?
Yeah.
Engage all your senses. Like see the trees swaying in the breeze, hear the birds chirping, maybe even feel the warmth of the sun on your skin.
So I'm bringing the phrase to life.
Exactly. The more real it feels, the better you'll remember it.
It's like I'm making a little movie in my head.
I like that analogy. Now, another powerful technique is anchoring.
Anchoring? That sounds interesting.
It is. You're basically connecting a physical action to an English phrase.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Let's say you're learning the expression to feel confident.
All right, to feel confident.
Choose a simple action like, snapping your fingers.
Snapping my fingers, okay.
Every time you repeat the phrase to feel confident, snap your fingers at the same time.
So my brain starts to link that action with the feeling of confidence.
And the English phrase. It's like creating a shortcut in your mind.
I see. So these techniques really tap into how our brains work naturally.
They do. We learn best through association and repetition, you know, and engaging multiple senses.
It's not just about memorizing lists of words. It's about making the language meaningful.
You got it. Now, before we wrap up, are there any resources you'd recommend for our listeners, like websites or apps that can help them practice these brain switch techniques?
Oh, absolutely. There are some fantastic platforms out there. One that I always recommend is Fluent.
Fluent, yeah. It's really great.
It uses authentic videos to teach you English.
So, like, instead of boring textbook dialogues.
You're learning from things like movie trailers and music videos.
Exactly. And they have these interactive subtitles that are really helpful.
You can click on any word you don't know.
And get the definition, see example sentences, everything.
It's so convenient. Another great resource is Memrise.
Memrise is awesome!
It uses flashcards and spaced repetition.
Spaced repetition.
Which means it shows you the words you're struggling with more often.
Super smart, right?
It is. Yeah. So there are so many tools available to help you on this brain switch journey.
And at the end of the day, the most important thing is your own dedication and belief in yourself.
Right. It's about mindset as much as it is about technique.
Absolutely. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Have fun with it.
It's a journey, and you're capable of achieving amazing things.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the brain switch.
A huge thank you to everyone for joining us on the Hatania English podcast.
Remember, you can do this. Keep practicing and never stop believing in your ability to become a fluent English speaker.
Happy learning, everyone.